Hello, I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we take a closer look into the state of the Russian economy. Primarily focused on powering the Kremlin's war machine for multiple years now, it remains uncertain how long exactly it will be able to keep up with the increasing demand. Targeted by a number of wide-ranging Western sanctions, Moscow's economic sector prioritizes military expenses, placing other domestic needs on the back burner. Multiple experts claim that this model is unsustainable in the long run. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
It is no secret that the war in Ukraine has been an extremely costly affair for both sides, both in terms of the price of equipment and in the cost of human lives. Russia has been putting a lot of its eggs into one basket, switching its economy into a war one. While on the outside the Russian government projects confidence and infinite funds, the situation is far from being all sunshine and rainbows for the Kremlin.
Russia is already bankrupt, so they cannot sustain this level of investment in war. But on the paper they're saying that they can, but that's not what the reality is.
A new report by a former Morgan Stanley and Bank of America financier says that Moscow has created a sort of shadow system to finance the war. This involves banks giving preferential loans to companies related to the war industry. Yet despite this powerful influx of money, other reports show that Russia's factories and plants are unable to meet the demands of the military. This points to severe levels of corruption and mismanagement. In the short term, this buys Putin time, but in the long term, it could have far-reaching consequences.
We are spending 6.3% of the GDP to improve our defense capability. We can't increase these military spendings indefinitely.
The switch to a wartime economy, very high interest rates and Western sanctions have all led to a dire situation for many Russians. Inflation is running rampant, something that even the authorities in Moscow have admitted is a bit of a problem. This means that Russia cannot fund its war indefinitely, not if it wants to keep its population at ease.
And now we're zooming in on Moscow to find out what really makes its economy tick. Russia's economy, despite the weight of relentless sanctions and the chaos of war, displays a paradoxical resilience. Against every forecast of collapse, the Kremlin navigated a modest contraction in 2022, only to register growth in 2023 and 2024. Yet beneath this veneer of endurance lies a series of Faustian bargains that threaten the nation's mid-term viability. Now, this resilience invites scrutiny as to whether it is a blessing or a curse. The Kremlin's strategy, ramping up state spending, enforcing authoritarian friend-shoring of trade, and aggressively pursuing import substitution, has kept capital circulating and bolstered consumption. However, these measures come at the expense of long-term economic health. More than 1,200 foreign companies have departed, narrowing consumer choices while inadvertently enriching domestic firms and deepening political patronage. The engine of this growth, heavily tied to military spending, proves to be a double-edged sword. Investments in war-related industries and infrastructure projects, particularly those aimed at boosting trade with China, have been critical here. Yet, without defense spending, the economy might well grind to a halt. Meanwhile, a shrinking workforce and unsustainable wartime production have begun to overheat the economy, driving wages upward and unleashing rampant consumer price inflation, even as interest rates soar to record heights. Amid these dynamics, a shadow financial system has emerged. Preferential loans funneled into war industries have ballooned corporate borrowing to alarming proportions. Such maneuvers, coupled with endemic corruption and mismanagement in the defense sector, paint a sobering picture. If this precarious balance is not remedied, Russia risks sliding into stagnation reminiscent of the 1980s Soviet malaise, with long-term economic consequences potentially proving irreversible. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Mark McNamee, co-founder of the Ukraine Business News Network. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, some have likened the Russian economy to a man using steroids to obtain some muscle. Others said, oh, steroids is actually too generous because this gives you muscle. Russia doesn't really have that. Instead, it's like a person running around on cocaine. What would be your take on that? How is the Russian economy doing nowadays?
Well, we can we can debate the drug of choice, but either analogy is pretty appropriate because it's not coming from increased productivity or other more fundamental drivers for sustained organic growth. So the analogies are relatively accurate. And looking forward, that's the question: how sustainable for how long is this? It's very reliant, of course, on continued defense spending, continued elevated oil prices, continued elevated oil volume exports, what Russia is actually able to produce and export, and then, of course, strong financial management. The central bank governor, what she has done for the Russian economy has really the professionalism within these institutions has been critical for Russia to sustain to this point, to the last few months at least, its fairly strong performance. But that's all coming into question literally as we speak. The last really 2 to 3 months is really shown the weaknesses that are now readily apparent and can only really worsen. So it's an opportune time when looking at the broader picture, of course, of what this means for the upcoming negotiations and Russia's ability to sustain and prosecute the war.
And then looking at the Russian economy from the outside, to what extent can we even actually gauge its capabilities accurately? Because Russia isn't really the model example when it comes to transparency. And some said this economy not only is quite opaque, but it may actually be running certain shadow schemes, essentially obscuring some of the mechanisms from view. Would you say that to any outsider, there is any way of determining to what extent the Russian economy is actually doing quite as well as it wants us to believe that it is?
Yeah, and that's a good place to start. We most definitely should not be looking at the Russian economy and the statistics that they've been presenting since really the onset of the full-scale war in the same way that we would, say, interpret data coming out of Germany or France or the United States or any other Western country. So this is a good place to actually sort of set the standard. And this is very clear. Russian government over the last couple of years have stopped reporting a number of categories of data: export data, budget revenue, budget expenditure data, investment data. And they're not doing that to obviously, they're not trying to hide all the good news, as is very clear. But then there's other very worrying signs, which they admit are in fact hidden. It was only reported recently by a Western academic, in fact, about the extreme corporate debt that Russia has accrued, which has basically been pushed by the government onto the corporate sector in order to continue to drive defense production. Those are debts that will eventually need to be paid. And of course, inflation-inducing over time. So you look in that area, you look in a number of other areas. For example, the hidden shadow budget, which is historically, it has always been devoted primarily to defense, security sector, intelligence agencies, et cetera. That is a very, very large amount of government spending every year. It's hidden as far as how much is actually spent and what it's spent on, but we can say assuredly, before the war, primarily is spent on defense, national security, intelligence agencies, et cetera. And obviously, since the onset of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, that's only increased. So that's a hidden part of the budget that we actually don't fully know about. And obviously, the budget categories of spending that we do know about that are public are very worrying if you are sitting in the Russian government, as far as how high it is currently, how much growth there has been each year, the last 3 years, and then the continued planned growth for this year as well.
And would you say that this is mostly because of so-called reflexive control, i.e. Russia hoping to create an image of itself in our eyes, in the eyes of the West, that it benefits, an image that benefits Russia itself, so controlling our reactions, making it seem as it is more able to control all these negative processes within the economy than it truly is able to? And to what extent do you think it might be because Russia can already see where this is going? It has already been there in the 1980s, where the spending exceeded like 13% of its GDP, the military spending. Now it is around 6% or exceeding 6%. So do they really want to hide the fact that they are actually embarking on a path that they have trodden once already? And guess what? The results were not pretty.
Right. Well, the 6% you mentioned is very likely an underestimate for the reasons we discussed. It's sort of hiding information. It's probably in reality closer to 8 or 9%. So quite elevated, and that's going to continue for the foreseeable future and get worse, very likely. As far as reflexive control, very good analogy. I appreciate you citing the 1980s because this is the whole point. This is the historic Russian or Soviet, but the Russian imperialistic playbook is this sort of policy of reflexive control. Perceptions matter. When you manufacture and create perceptions in the West, with your enemy, that's how policies are made, based upon perceptions. And the Soviets very well understood this. The Russian Federation under Putin very well understands that, and they use that to their advantage, of course. And this goes back for centuries. Russia hiding its backwardness, hiding its weaknesses vis-a-vis the West. There's always been a strong understanding within Russian political culture, within the Kremlin, that they are behind the West, that they are at once unable to sort of maintain a peaceful coexistence with the West, but also completely behind the West, militarily, financially, economically, et cetera. And so part of their policy has always been manufacture impressions, manufacture perceptions in the West in order to, relatively speaking, strengthen your position. And there's no more important time than now, as they're trying to, of course, manufacture perceptions in the West and within the Trump administration of much greater strength of Russia as they enter into these negotiations.
Now, skeptics say that we should not underestimate the Russian economy either, because it does have the advantage of being fairly rugged, resilient, at least where it matters. Like some people are drawing the analogy to World War II, when the economy that was fairly inefficient during the early days of the Soviet Union was actually pushed into overdrive due to the simple psychological threat of the invasion by Nazi Germany. And all of a sudden you had production lines being established within weeks, working overtime, 24/7. Some say, look, this is what Russia wants to achieve now. Do you think that this could be the overlooked advantage that will allow it at least to work on a rudimentary basis for a long time, even after the more sophisticated branches of the economy might begin to fail?
Sure, but it relies on sacrifices that are unavoidable elsewhere. So, for example, the World War II analogy is very appropriate. That's obviously a more extreme situation than the current situation. But it's an appropriate analogy insofar as extraordinary sacrifice. And by the way, they relied on extraordinary Western and specifically American support where they couldn't provide it, which was critical to winning the war for the combined efforts of the Western allies and the Soviet Union. You look at today, there are sacrifices that have to be made. So you're seeing deferred government spending on healthcare, infrastructure, education. So in one area, they're sacrificing, in these areas, they're sacrificing long-term, the long-term viability of the state, long-term growth for current conditions and the prosecution of this war. But then also, clearly, they are handing over, essentially, certain sectors of the economy almost to their current ally in China. So the auto sector is one area, various areas of retail. China really moving in quite strongly, replacing the West. And that's because domestically, Russia doesn't have the capacity to produce, to manufacture in many of these areas. Russia doesn't export high-valued products, obviously a commodity-based economy. And so they're relying on external partners, in this case, primarily China, to fill those gaps. So it's just, where do you want to make the sacrifices in the budget in terms of infrastructure, education, healthcare spending, and then relying on external partners. So obviously not necessarily a winning strategy for the long term.
And now the million-dollar question, I would have said million ruble question, but because the currency is not really doing that well, I would have devalued my question automatically. So $1 million it is. Let's think about the trigger which could cause the Russian economy to go belly up. Is there anything like that at the moment? Because some people say, okay, the signs of an impending crisis might be there, but you do need a trigger. Without a trigger, all of that, once again, is statistics. And Russia could pull through if it is lucky, or if it uses some stimuli for the economy to at least prevent it from collapsing altogether. Do we have anything like that on the horizon right now? Anything that could be the tipping point?
Sure. I would say there's two areas to look to for finding potential macroeconomic instability. One, I would say, which people should not underestimate, would be on the administrative management side. There's been clear pressure on the central bank, and this is fairly rare. Putin had given the central bank head, Nabiullina, a lot of autonomy and independence over the last several years, which is not necessarily typical for most dictatorial states. And that was a very prudent decision because her management of the economy over the last decade has been crucial to Russia being in this current position where it is, which isn't, it could be far worse. We are now seeing more political and pressure and from the business community on her. So watch out for a potential personnel change, which that itself, if they then alter, the central bank loses independence potentially, they alter central bank policies, that could create instability. And then secondly, Russia relies, 35% of the budget is reliant upon oil exports, going after oil exports. And very encouragingly, we're seeing from the Trump administration a very conscious, intentional plan, at the moment at least, nothing's been put into action, but a plan to address Russia's oil export revenues, going after the shadow fleet more, which Biden did in the last week of his administration. And then also enforcing the oil price cap, potentially lowering the oil price cap, pushing on Saudi Arabia to increase output to then help drive down global oil prices. So there's a number of areas where they could be doing this and putting a lot more pressure, which would have a significant impact this year. It would take a few months to implement and have the desired impact, but that would have a notable impact on Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war at the level it's been prosecuting it, and then, of course, in the end, on Russia's negotiating position.
So for what you're saying, not only is the trigger there, but we actually have the finger on the trigger. The big question is, are we prepared to use it? Mark McNamee was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. US President Donald Trump has hailed some progress in talks concerning the war in Ukraine. The American leader has so far refused to provide the details of his recent communication with Vladimir Putin, however.
Donald Trump has confirmed the recent reports that he has had some contact with the Russian president. While he declined to reveal what exactly he discussed with Putin, the US president believes that progress is being made concerning the war in Ukraine. He also said that the US remains in contact with both Moscow and Kiev. Trump has shown a readiness to meet with Vladimir Putin at what he dubbed the right time. Ending the war in Ukraine has been the top priority for the new US administration. Donald Trump wants to accomplish this within the first 100 days of his new term, though there have been some voices pointing to the unlikelihood of a peace treaty being reached so quickly. It is currently unclear how the US president wants to bring Moscow to the negotiating table. Ideas have been floated about pressuring Russia with sanctions or postponing Ukraine's NATO accession. Nothing, however, has been fully confirmed.
The Ukrainian border guard says that the number of attempts to illegally cross the country's border have nearly halved since the summer of 2024. The border guard spokesperson says that despite this drop, attempts occur every single day.
The number of attempts to illegally cross the Ukrainian border dropped by 45% in January compared to July 2024. Conscription-age Ukrainian men are currently prohibited from leaving the country, which is under martial law, save for a few exceptions. Despite these restrictions, many of them try to escape to neighboring countries in hopes of dodging mobilization. The majority of these cases occur outside of border guard checkpoints on Ukraine's borders with Romania and Moldova. There have also been attempts to cross into Hungary and Slovakia. Some people have even tried to flee by swimming across the Tisza River, which flows along Ukraine's border with Hungary, Romania and Moldova. There have also been attempts to illegally cross through the checkpoints themselves.
Russian authorities are cracking down on illegal migrants and draft dodgers. There have recently been cases of the Russian police carrying out raids to detain such individuals.
Russian media report that police officers and other uniformed services carried out a raid on an MMA club and gym in St. Petersburg. The The goal was to find illegal migrants and draft dodgers. Among 50 men present in the gym club at the time of the raid, half of them were foreigners. The police identified 6 undocumented migrants from Central Asia and 12 foreigners who possessed Russian citizenships but had ignored a military summons. This is not the first time that the Russian police carried out such a roundup. There is currently a widespread crackdown on migrants across the country. Many of them are pressured into accepting citizenships and conscription cards, or else they will be deported.
Romanian President Klaus Iohannis has announced that he will be resigning to avert a potential political crisis. The decision comes in the wake of far-right opposition parties submitting an initiative to impeach Iohannis for staying in office longer than his prescribed term.
The incumbent Romanian president remained in office in the wake of the annulment of the first round of the country's presidential elections last year. Now, to avoid exacerbating Romania's political crisis, the president has decided to step down. Iohannis has been serving as president since 2014. According to Romania's constitution, the chairman of the Senate will serve as the interim head of state. The results of the first round of the presidential vote from November were annulled by the country's constitutional court. The reason given was alleged Russian interference and the hybrid election campaign focused on social media, which propped up a far-right candidate. The candidate, Calin Georgescu, went on to win the first round by securing 23% of the vote. Georgescu opposes military aid for Ukraine, the transit of Ukrainian grain through Romania, and has been highly critical of NATO itself.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.